Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Wherever you're listening in from, we're glad you're here. I'm Paige McGarry, Associate HEOR, RWE, and Market Access Category Manager at Scientist.com. This is Insights and Outcomes, a HealthEconomics.com podcast. Today, we'll take a deep dive into the world of real-world data, where the complexities of healthcare data are reshaping decision-making. We'll unpack how RWD challenges traditional study designs, the unexpected patterns that emerge, and what these findings mean for how we define product value and effectiveness in healthcare. But before we jump in, I'm excited to introduce today's guest. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Vernon Schabert, founder of Epilogix. With over 28 years of experience in health economics and pharmacoepidemiology, Dr. Schabert is recognized for his innovative research across 19 countries and for delivering expert services in healthcare data, analytics, and value access. Vernon, it's great to have you on the podcast today.
Well, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here and really looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. Now, if you're ready, we're going to start with a fun little game we call Ins and Outs. A series of slides are going to come up, and I'll read the prompts that have been selected by my colleagues, and we'll both answer in or out depending on if it's something we would or wouldn't do. Ready?
Bring it on.
Okay. Having a drawer full of random chargers and cables because they might come in handy one day.
I will confess that not only do I have this drawer, but I have organized it with dividers for US and EU, given that I'm currently working here in the Republic of North Macedonia. So yes, I have that drawer, but it is scarily well organized.
Oh wow, you have me beat. I have it as well, but it's definitely a chaos junk drawer. Bad habit. I need to organize. I've been meaning to order a cable organizer, so that's a good idea. Okay. Leaving a group chat on mute, but still reading everything. Yes, I'm in on this one. Sorry, mom and dad, if you're listening, I absolutely have muted our family chat once or twice. But I promise I still read everything.
I need to focus on one thing. So if I'm supposed to be chatting, I'm going to chat, and then I'm going to do reading at some other time.
Finding the gate before you can relax at the airport. Yes, I'm absolutely in on this one. And funny enough, I've actually almost missed boarding before, even after I found my gate. My friend and I were traveling around Europe, and I didn't know that everyone lines up far before they even announce boarding. So yeah, embarrassingly enough, sat at the gate, was staring at the gate, and totally almost missed the flight.
Well, I have definitely missed connections at airports because I was trying to send off one more email. So yes, I need to get where I'm ready to go, and make sure that I'm prepared for the next step in the journey.
Yeah, I always have to see it, know it exists, and then I can go get snacks or do whatever else I'm doing at the airport. Talking to your pet like they're a person. Yeah, my dog is fully a person in my eyes, and she thinks that she's a person as well.
If you're welcoming an animal into your home as a pet, why would you not speak to them like they were a person?
Exactly. They have feelings too. I'm convinced they can listen.
My confusion here in Europe, since I'm an American but I'm currently working abroad, is to try and figure out what language to speak to pets in. So that's the big challenge there.
Making a to-do list and adding things you've already done just to cross them off. Yes, I do this, and I really just like checking things off lists, and it also makes me feel more productive. So if I have bigger tasks on my to-do list and I've done little parts of those tasks, I'll absolutely put the little parts on so I can just tick them off.
My wife would very clearly be a yes on this, but for me, added items on the list just makes me anxious. So if I've already done them, they're not going on to come back off.
Fair enough. Okay, perfect. That was our game.
Fantastic.
Okay, that was so fun. Now let's dive into why everyone is listening today. Vernon, as we navigate through the next few years, one of the big questions on everyone's mind is how do you see the demand for real-world data changing over the next few years?
That's interesting because I think we see a lot of attention and marketing in real-world evidence right now that's focused specifically on regulatory and HTA applications. So things like comparing efficacy at product launch by taking an arm from a clinical trial for the product and matching it up against a synthetic control arm from comparators based on real world data. I think we've also seen a lot of growth and interest in pragmatic trials where a product that's already launched might be interested in expanding its indication. So rather than going back for a registered phase 3 trial, we try to construct that trial out of real world data. So These are very exciting and sexy things for those of us who have been working with real world data for decades. It's exciting to see new stakeholders in the market paying attention to this data source and being willing to consider it for a broader set of discussions on product value. But I think that this marketing aside, I have a hard time imagining how these particular use cases will contribute substantially to the growth of the industry as a whole. For example, I know you spoke with Rosa on one of your previous podcasts about the European Union Joint Clinical Assessment, which is making broader use of real-world data for these regulatory applications. But right now, that applies only to a limited number of oncology and other high-value products, and only in that very short period right around product launch. So that leaves a lot of time on the table, not only for those expensive projects that are eligible for the joint clinical assessments, but for any other products that are not, to be looking at real-world data for all sorts of value-related uses throughout the product lifecycle. Things like identifying unmet need, sharpening value propositions as you evolve the product through its life cycle, optimizing commercial implementation strategies, actually measuring comparative effectiveness after you've had a decent amount of time in the real world to demonstrate your product up against comparators, and other ways of influencing prescriber behavior and patient access. So all of these things are useful throughout that product life cycle, and are not necessarily regulatory uses. But I think that marketing attention on regulatory applications also misses one thing in that it really undervalues the real part of real world evidence. They're all designed on framing still real world randomized clinical trials as the gold standard and trying to shape and squeeze and finesse real world data to match the expectations and the schedule of assessments and exposures that are in those trials. So I find it hard to imagine that we can really grow the use cases for RWE if the major marketing push is actually apologizing for one of the product's main features.
That's really interesting. I've never thought about it like that. And now I'm curious, there's often a tension between controlling bias in clinical studies and representing sort of the messy realities of healthcare. How do study designs evolve to address both of these needs?
I wish that there was more of that tension observed, because I do think that there is still this bias towards we have to make the data look perfect. But
and clean
but it's a great question, and I think resolving that tension in any individual situation really depends on appreciating the context behind the research question. So there are absolutely times when we are focused on isolating the efficacy of a product and trying to remove all of those other confounders and constraints. And those are times when it's important to have high levels of control, which is why we still value randomized assignment to treatments in a clinical trial, and why when we're dealing with observational studies using real world data, we always want to have on hand this robust set of tools, whether methodological or statistical, to control out some of those things that we might think are confounding with the effects we're looking at. But I also think it's important to remember that we've made a distinction in this industry between efficacy, which is the outcomes and effects of a product in idealized settings, and effectiveness, the effects and outcomes of a product in the usual settings of care where we normally see these products used. And when we're looking at things that are a bit more related to effectiveness or how the product is used in the real world, I think we have to be careful about how much effort we put into placing those controls and constraints on the study design. So I think this is an important set of distinctions, and there are techniques to be done in this process, but we can end up doing things like throwing out too many cases in one treatment arm, where we've had trouble making an apples to apples comparison between two products. And what that should tell us is we're in that situation that maybe we're learning something about how the healthcare system, the prescribers, and the patients actually view these products and use them and consider them differently. Likewise, if we have to do extensive data cleaning on a set of data in order to meet some set of expectations about how patients should be exposed to the product, what should happen afterwards, how they route themselves in the healthcare system, we might be getting clues about how things are actually different in the real world than we are bringing our naive expectations. We have to remember that we prescribe and reimburse in the real world, and the messiness is actually the point.
Yeah. The messiness can be just as valuable as the trial itself. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
And we know that healthcare is never straightforward. And so, in your view, how can we better capture the unexpected use of drugs by providers and patients when evaluating product effectiveness in real world settings?
So I think there's one key strategy to that, and that's viewing real world data when we look at it, similar to the way that Michelangelo would view a block of marble. So if you remember that famous statue of David in Florence, that was not originally his to work on. Some other artist had started that sculpture and had started blocking things out and maybe wasn't doing such a great job. The people that owned that block of marble took it away from him and started commissioning a new artist to fix it. And many famous artists were trying to get that job, including Michelangelo's mentor, Leonardo da Vinci. Michelangelo won it because his pitch was this: look, I'm coming in and I'm seeing all of the possible sculptures that could come out of that piece of marble. And my job is not to make you a sculpture. My job is to chip away the marble on the outside until the right sculpture is revealed. Now, it's probably a little presumptuous for a health economist to be comparing himself to Michelangelo. I understand that.
Hey, I like the analogy.
But I think that framing is really helpful. When we are dealing with real world data, it usually has not been collected explicitly for the purpose of the study that we want to do. It's been done for clinical reasons, for legal compliance, for reimbursement purposes, and we need to appreciate the behaviors that are in that block of data, and also the decisions that have been made on how to record those behaviors before we can really do a good job of designing a study that's got high ecological validity and is going to tell us about the value of the products that we're observing there. So I've actually had some experience doing this because before I did a career in health economics, I was a social psychologist by training. And we really focus a lot in social psychology on passive indirect measures of behavior, because we've learned very quickly that the more invasive we are in getting in and measuring and asking people how they do, they're aware of us and that they try to behave the right way. So I've been able to take this concept of human behavior frames and really apply it to the data that we've used for our studies for decades, to really come up with a study that's more sensitive to what's going on inside that block of data, and really, helping us to understand those real behaviors.
That's really interesting because in a way you almost don't want to place limitations on yourself. And I would say, when you're trying to get a certain result or you're trying to do a certain study, you could be or subconsciously placing those limitations without even realizing it, like Michelangelo.
Absolutely. And I think there are lots of times when researchers do feel constrained and feel like they have to place those limitations for genuinely important reasons. Sometimes there are time and cost constraints that prevent you from doing the detailed investigation and understanding of exploratory data analysis, from talking to stakeholders in the region where the data have been sourced to really understand how healthcare administrators and clinicians are using things. So that can be a challenge. Sometimes people are handed someone else's protocol that's already made assumptions on what that behavior should look like, and they really don't have much of a chance to change it. Sometimes we're trying to do a high threshold study, like an HETE, hypothesis evaluation of treatment effect study, that ISPOR and ISPI decided a few years ago was useful. And there we feel like, we have to be a priori and keep our hands off the data and not get too close. So I think in those cases, it's really important to sit down and do that early investigation and design work well before you get into the design, so that you're aware of what behaviors are going on in your disease area, in your region, so that you can appreciate and how to design that study that's sensitive both to the question you want to answer and to the data that you're presented with.
Yeah. Makes sense. This sort of ties in perfectly to what I was going to say next. So real world data doesn't always follow the neat lines that we expect. And you mentioned that scientists and policymakers need to decide whether unexpected data patterns are noise or reflective of actual behaviors. And can you provide examples where data patterns surprised you in real world studies?
Well, absolutely. And I think we've actually not only seen, examples, but we find that there are three particular cases where people get tripped up with these unexpected behaviors. So the first of these cases is where healthcare stakeholders are knowingly circumventing either clinical practice guidelines or reimbursement rules or other workflows in order to meet some other goal or objective. So I'm reminded of some early studies we did in the first few years of tumor necrosis factor inhibitors. These are biologic drugs used to treat a large number of autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis, ankylosing spondylitis. And in the first couple of years that these products were out on the market, they had to be injected or infused by a physician. And eventually we got comfortable with the safety and the use of the products, and the FDA allowed manufacturers to apply and say, yes, patients could inject these on their own. And we could now start distributing them through retail pharmacies for patients to take and dose at home. So as we started looking at treatment patterns and safety signals in the years over this transition, we started seeing some really alarming looking behaviors. Patients were coming in to physician offices for these drugs and getting injected with what appeared to be lethal doses and then disappearing for a month, then coming back, and the cycle happens all over again. So this looks odd, and it looks like something that's going to cause us a lot of problems in measuring our study variables.
Some alarm bells might be going
Exactly.
off. Yeah.
So we start asking around and checking, and what we realized is, not surprisingly, physicians get paid an extra billing code for injecting in the office, and they didn't want to lose that money. So rather than sending patients to retail pharmacy, they started acting in their offices like a retail pharmacy on their own. So they weren't actually shooting up patients with a month's worth of product. They were handing them a box and sending them home, but also they only had certain bill codes that they could use to make sure that they got reimbursed. And so they ended up adding this product cost to the system because they were getting this extra injection code for passing these things along. And it was causing, challenges from total healthcare spend in the system. In addition to that, there were other real world impacts on how different stakeholders were being affected by this. Obviously, patients were losing some access to the drug because if they wanted to be on these biologics with certain providers, they had to make a physician appointment. They couldn't use the pharmacy that was available to other patients depending on who their provider was. At the time, we also knew that many US payers were managing their pharmacy and medical budgets separately. So this change happens and the pharmacy benefit manager is expecting a big spike in their monthly spend. The utilization manager who's accountable for medical spend in the plan is expecting a drop, and both of them are surprised. And now they're fighting because the pharmacy manager is really happy with the change and the medical one is pulling his hair out. So there's lots of impacts on this, including people trying to design safety studies who might be looking at this, and if they're not aware of the pattern, might be seeing overdoses that they have to report as an adverse event. So lots of different, real world impacts happening to stakeholders and also impacting the perception of the product value.
Interesting. And earlier you mentioned 3 cases that illustrate this challenge. What are the others, and do you have other examples to share?
Thanks for the prompt. So the second case that we see is when patients have control over the timing and quantity of their dosing and exposure for a product. Now, we know that there are lots of studies on medication adherence and utilization. We give patients a bottle of 30 pills and send them home from the pharmacy. We hope that they take a pill a day, and we expect that, but we don't really know. But there are also some circumstances when patients end up having outsized influence on the timing and quantity of their dosing exposure that can cause some real unexpected behaviors. Looking back again to those TNF blockers I was just mentioning, they tend to suppress a patient's immune response. So if a patient is on these drugs and ends up with a bacterial or a fungal infection, the instructions are stop taking your biologic, treat the infection, and take what we call a drug holiday from the biologic medication. So makes sense, all normal part of the clinical practice guideline. But when we started looking at this in examining treatment patterns and outcomes, we found that patients were taking a holiday that was much, much longer than would be expected, either by our normal expectations, how we normally measure persistence and adherence on these medications, or really by reasonable clinical expectations about how long it would take for an infection to resolve. So if we hadn't gone in and figured some of these details out, we could have come up with the idea that lots of people were just discontinuing these medications. But then when we looked ahead, we found that the largest new drug that came on when people discontinued was the drug that they had just continued. So all we had to do was adjust the window for those medication holidays, and we could get back into the swing of things. We also discovered, looking in the early years of GLP-1 drugs, which are very much on everyone's minds nowadays for obesity and diabetes medications, we looked at dosing of the earliest ones in Germany. And one of the early GLP-1 products came with a variable dose pen because you were supposed to titrate up the medication. So rather than giving a tiny pen and a medium pen and a big pen, people would just click the number and gradually start increasing their dose. And we found, lo and behold, they did a good job of that at home. But because they realized right away that they weren't getting the maximum dose, they were often supposed to be switching to the GLP-1 from other drugs, often including drugs that probably shouldn't have been taken at the same time. And there we found they weren't willing to do that. So they titrated up and they kept all of their other drugs. And even when they were up to the maintenance dose, they were very reluctant to discontinue some of these other medications. So now this has a couple of important real-world impacts. For patients, there's a safety issue, right? If you're taking a drug that doesn't jive with this GLP-1, you're exposing yourself to safety risk. But also payers were hoping that they were willing to reimburse this expensive new drug because they were going to get patients on a better drug. What instead they found is that they were just paying for more drug, the expensive new one, and not having patients get off of these other drugs that were there. So important real-world impacts to be looking at in these unexpected behaviors.
Absolutely. And the third case?
Thank you. So the third case that we find is when we find a perception of a product's value that ends up creating bias on who gets access to it. So in a research context, we often talk about selection bias in a generic way that, new drugs are given to certain kinds of patients, et cetera. But sometimes this can be a bit more fundamental. So recently we're working with a manufacturer who had a CNS product that was entering the market in a mature area. So lots of other comparators out in the market. Clinical trial data was great. Showed really good effectiveness and represented a real improvement in the options for patients. But medication management was a little bit more involved in the early phases of exposing patients to this drug. So we're starting to build that early analysis of the patients and the prescribers and the healthcare systems to get ready for that first post-launch study to be able to show effectiveness. And what we realized is we were learning not only a lot about the patients that were exposed to the drug, but also about the prescribers. Now, in a lot of real-world data sources, we end up not getting very good detail on prescribers. And a big reason behind that is that prescribers are usually either a direct or indirect source of those data. And you can expect they'd want a little bit extra blinding in a research database because they don't want marketers coming after them. They don't want academic detailers coming in and telling them to prescribe more of this or less of that. They also don't want patients saying, hey, I saw that I was in this study of yours and what's going on. So we have to work harder to learn things about the prescribers that are involved. So we started seeing that the patients that were getting exposed to this drug were being treated by prescribers that actually took a lot more care in documenting the details of their patient care. Subtypes of this condition, which usually were undercoded in real-world data, seem to be very accurately coded in this patient population, not only for the patients getting the new drug, but also for other patients in the same practices. And as we started piecing together the puzzle, we realized that we had highly motivated patients that were seeking care through the healthcare system, not necessarily seeking out this drug, but finding their way to advanced specialists who were very up to date on current treatment, advances. And the prescribers that they were getting in touch with were very excited about the clinical trials data and were much more likely to prescribe patients on this drug. So now we find some interesting real world impacts here. There's still a patient access challenge. Patients who don't get lucky enough to be with one of these specialist physicians are losing the opportunity to have a chance to be prescribed on this new product that's on market. We're also seeing that the physicians who aren't prescribing it are waiting for data that will show them that it's worthwhile prescribing this drug in the market. But to do a good real world comparative effectiveness study, you need apples to apples patients. And we found different patients going to different providers, and it was hard for us to piece this together. So we found that the manufacturer and the payers and the prescribers who might be benefiting from that good real world study were in a vicious cycle. They couldn't make a decision to prescribe the new drug until they had evidence. We couldn't get the evidence because they weren't making the decision to prescribe the new drug.
Oof. That's brutal positive feedback loop that's going on there. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And as we dig deeper into real world evidence, it becomes clear that the process of data cleaning and exclusion in regulatory grade studies can lead to different populations or study designs that then emphasize usual care and the treatment patterns. And if these exclusions and data cleaning lead to different answers, how should we define product value within these different perspectives?
So I think I should make clear that there are a lot of times when we don't get different answers or different populations. There are many cases where the findings that we see in a clinical trial are matched with what we see in real world evidence. Maybe not the exact same, findings, but in the same direction with slightly different, effect sizes or magnitudes. When that happens, it's actually the best of both worlds, obviously, because we've shown that the idealized settings and the real world settings in usual care are lining up, and we have a pretty robust expectation for what kind of value we can get from the product. What we actually see more often when there's a discrepancy is not good in real world trial or in RCTs and bad in real world evidence, but good in RCTs and inconclusive or complicated or difficult in real world evidence.
Interesting.
Now, the people that are really pushing for regulatory grade RWE are thinking, well, problem solved. We're just going to push and squeeze and force these data into the right shape, and we'll make it look like a trial, and we'll get rid of all of these things in the real world and not have a problem. But that actually doesn't often happen. And we end up advising our clients of a different strategy altogether. Before your product is launched, you really need to be getting a deep understanding, not just from your commercial and brand and marketing teams, but also from your exploration of real world data, what the patterns are in patients, in prescribers, in healthcare systems, in various places where you're going to be exploring, expansion of your market. Sometimes this can happen with comparators that are already out on the market in a more mature market setting. Sometimes, even if there are comparators out there, you have to wait until your product is in market a little bit and start getting some experience to see whether your product's entry is kind of shifting the rules of the game. But in either case, that pathway to the first true post-launch study is really fertile ground for understanding all of these nuances that can end up shaping how best to design your study and getting your outcomes. Now, in that environment, if you do find a discrepancy, sometimes that discrepancy is about product value, but more often it's about behaviors that are happening in the healthcare system that are unnecessarily confounding the perception of your product value. Sometimes they're behaviors that need to be eradicated. So that first example we talked about with prescribers trying to resist the shift to dispensing in pharmacies, that was adding cost to the healthcare system. We needed to stop that, and we needed to find ways to improve that enforcement. It wasn't until we explored those data in detail that we had tools for payers to say this is a problem, and we now have a way to enforce this with intransigent physicians. But there are other circumstances when that discrepancy can actually cause us to step back and reevaluate what it is that we think about product value and how healthcare should be delivered in the first place. This isn't a project or a product that I worked on specifically, but I do recall many years ago, we found that physicians were taking the cancer drug Avastin and diluting it substantially and using it to treat macular degeneration in the retina, while there was already a substantially similar product out on the market, Lucentis, that was indicated explicitly for this purpose. So this dilution problem, well, it's saving cost, but it's also not exactly the right way to be using the product. But we found that payers and regulators were paying attention to this. And in fact, many EU HTAs actually implemented head-to-head real-world trials of Avastin diluted versus Lucentis full strength, trying to figure out whether they should change their expectations about what to grant access to, how to reimburse in this market. So there can definitely be times when the discrepancies are fueled by things that, the unexpected behavior is something that is now a candidate for becoming the preferred or recommended behavior.
Interesting. Well, Vernon, thank you so much for being here today and helping us all realize that maybe we don't need to be so afraid of the real world data anymore. I know I've learned a lot from our conversation, and I'm sure our listeners will too. It was really a pleasure to have you on, and we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.
Thanks. I enjoyed it a great deal. I really appreciate the time to chat, and happy studying.
Thank you. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. It helps more listeners like you find the show. Want more HEOR, RWE, and market access insights? Stay connected with Theoretically Speaking and HealthEconomics.Com for the latest trends shaping healthcare decision-making. Until then, keep asking the big questions, challenging assumptions, and driving smarter healthcare decisions. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Paige McGarry, and we'll see you next time.